Okay, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday to you. The weekend is almost here. It's so close, right? We just got a couple things to tie up before the end of today, and then and then we'll be done. Okay. So Cindy's here. Good morning, Cindy. Aliana's here. Good morning to you, Aliana. Hello again, Thika. Hello again, Karen. Mashid's here. Good morning again, Mashid. Good morning, Lily. Good morning, Michael. And Lim, good morning to you. Hello, Ella. Good evening. Um, Min is here. Good morning, Min. Good morning, Caleb. Good morning, Jenna. Again, Jenna. Good morning, Carmen. Good morning, KC. And Pearly's here. Good morning, Pearly. And Ying is here too. Good morning, Ying. Okay. So what we'll do today is we will just kind of tie up the loose ends on China. We'll talk about, we'll do just sort of a quick review of some of the things we've learned. And I think, good morning, Adalbert. And I think that might be it. I was thinking that yesterday I gave social justice all of their class to work on their micropaper. And yesterday I only gave you part of this class to work on, or part of yesterday's class to work on yours. So I think I'll give you part of this class to do it too, and then it'll be fair. Then I'll be even, because I don't want to be unfair. Good morning, Albert. I say good morning to you, and Chiffon, good morning to you. So without, and Jimmy's here too. Good morning, Jimmy. Good morning again. Okay, without further ado, let's jump in. Okay, so this is the last day for China, right? And obviously China has a very complex history. We've only dealt with kind of a specific part of China. We haven't really walked all the way through history. We've kind of just popped in at a few places. So obviously there's quite a bit more to learn here. But again, we just don't have time to give China the proper treatment that it deserves. But yesterday we were talking about, we were sort of debriefing on the film we watched, and we said that the first Qin Emperor brings this long period of political instability and political decentralization. He brings that period to an end, the Warring States period, when he manages to defeat all the other kingdoms and unite them under his own power, right? And so for a short time, he rules united China with kind of absolute power. And we also learned that he ruled from a perspective of legalism, right? And so that idea of legalism came to us from an earlier period, right, from the Zhou period, but it was kind of a system based on law and organization in order to ensure that the ruler or the emperor had absolute power over the territory, right? And that was probably a response to the Warring States period, where the political organization of the early Zhou didn't seem to work out, right? We said that eventually those kings that were supposed to be loyal to the main Zhou king, they kind of stopped being loyal, right? And that's when they started fighting with each other. And so this legalist approach is a way for the emperor to maintain control of his whole territory, right? And so we talked about these things that Shenyang did, that were devised in the Zhou period, but found their way into the Qin dynasty as well. We said that the Qin state had very clear legal codes and very clear punishments. Hello, Sabrina. Very clear punishments when people broke the law. And so it was a period where China was under the absolute power of one person, and that power was used in a very heavy way. There was very clear laws, but also strict punishments for breaking them, right? And so we read that section yesterday, and we said that the Han Dynasty begins kind of shortly after the Qin Empire. Sorry. So the first Qin Emperor will die. We saw in the film that he was taking mercury in order to prolong his life, but unfortunately he didn't know that will end your life, which it did. And so the first Qin emperor dies. He has some successors that follow him, some emperors in his line, but they turn out to be not really as strong as him, not as decisive of a leader as him. And so that probably related to another couple of issues as well. So demands on the population for taxes and military service, and just probably the tiring of the people of living under this climate of fear, right? These harsh punishments by the Qin emperors causes them to rebel and to revolt. And so they revolt for a few years. Everybody kind of there's a few years of civil war as somebody tries to gain control of United China. And finally, Liu Bong, a farmer, herdsman, who manages to make himself the head of an army and manages to defeat everyone. He declares himself the new emperor, and the first in a new dynasty called the Han. Good morning, Sam. And so here's Liu Bong. He's a handsome devil, right? Nice beard. So Liu Bong becomes the first emperor of the Han Dynasty. And the Han will be important to Chinese history because it will last for quite some time. It will last for hundreds of years. And again, it will set the foundation for Chinese culture and Chinese political organization that follow the Han, right? So, so Liu Bong makes himself the first emperor of the Han Dynasty. We said that during the Han Dynasty, most people were farmers, right? Some people owned their own land. Some people rented it. Some people were landowners that rented their land to farmers. But most people in China were involved in farming, and that was a situation that would persist for almost until the creation of the People's Republic of China in 1949. China would remain a predominantly agricultural country for hundreds of years. So we said most people were farmers, but there were about 10% of the population that were kind of city dwellers, people living in cities. And so some of these people were artists, some people were tradesmen, some people were business people, government officials, bureaucracy, soldiers, things like that. But even at this time, we're looking at a population of 60 million people. So that's a lot of people living in this part of the world at this point in history. Of course, now it doesn't seem like very much because China has more than 1 billion people. But at the time, 60 million people is a massive empire. That's a huge empire for this point in history. So we said Han China had a very organized government state, and we said that it was kind of a government that had different levels to it, right? And so there was one level that was responsible for cities and towns, and they answered to a higher level of government, and another one. And finally, it went all the way up to the emperor to make big decisions, right? So the emperor's on top making these big decisions, and everyone below him is making smaller decisions and making sure that everything runs correctly. And again, that's a very typical way that states are organized today, right? We have multiple levels of government. And so yesterday I said here in Canada, we have municipal governments that are in charge of cities. We have provincial governments that are in charge of provinces. And then we have a federal government, which is in charge of the whole country, right? And looks after issues that affect the whole country. And so that's kind of how we run Canada. That's how many modern states run. And again, that's how we see ancient China running as well, or how we see the Han Dynasty governing itself. So the Han Dynasty inherited the Qin legalist system, but they also did something important in that they integrated Confucian ideas into the way that they ruled Han society. And so we said that was probably would have been very gratifying for our friend Confucius, right? He died some centuries earlier, but his ideas persist. And so, in contrast to the very brutal, the very strict way in which the Qin emperors organized society, the Han rulers decided to try to get people to behave and do what they wanted them to do based on Confucian ideas, right? And so during the Han period, starting with Emperor Wu, those ideas that we talked about that Confucius had about humanity and ritual and treating other people well, and garbage trucks going down the alleyway, and filial piety, right? Respect for your parents and your elders. All of those ideas started to get worked into how the state should function. And so that's what we called Imperial Confucianism, right? Confucius's ideas mixed into how the state was organized and how it was run, right? So we said there was lots of writing that happened. Those ideas of Confucius were expanded upon and were encoded into the state. And it actually, those Confucian ideas actually become kind of a part of the state's identity, right? It's part of who they see themselves as, not only as members of the Han Empire, but also as Confucians, right? As defenders of Confucian civilization. And so, again, these ideas get worked into how people live their lives and how people behave in society. And again, that was really exactly what Confucius was trying to do. That's exactly what he wanted. He just didn't accomplish that in his lifetime, but it does happen, right? And then lastly, yesterday we talked about the Silk Road, which to some degree already existed, connecting China with the Near East, with Mesopotamia, and further with Europe, right? And so we said that there was some trade going on by the time the Han period started, but the Han emperors made that trade route more safe, right? They sent out military garrisons to guard the Silk Road and to provide some sort of protection and law for people trading. And so as a result, the trade on the Silk Road began to increase, right? And this was going to be very helpful for China because the more trade you engage in, the more money you make. And so the Han Empire was in part enriched by the fact that trade on the Silk Road began to increase. And again, it increased because the Han Empire made it safer for people to travel that road, and they wouldn't have to worry about robbers or anything like that. Okay, which brings me to, sorry, I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit here, which brings me to a bit of a summary. So what are some of the most important things that we should remember about how Chinese culture interacts with the environment? What kind of environmental things should we remember? Okay, so Cindy says, I almost forgot about this stuff. So Cindy says, yeah, we have two major river systems that serve as the foundation for the complex cultures that will come later, right? So we have the Yellow River in the north. We have the Yellow River in the north, and we have the Yangtze in the south, right? And so both of those rivers will allow people to engage in intensive agriculture. It will allow them to grow lots of food, and as a result, people can diversify. They can start doing other things, and more complicated economic and political structures can emerge from that. And so, yeah, the rivers are important. The Yellow in the north and the Yangtze in the south. Karen says there was lots of inventions such as gunpowder and paper and an earthquake detector. They introduced row planting to make it easier to harvest crops, and they had made many musical instruments, and they had a Great Wall of China. So those are all true. As some of these connect to the environment, of course. Well, everything would have been made from natural materials, that's for sure. But the row planting is an intensive agriculture invention, right? It helps people to grow more food. Yeah. What else do we have? More culture and environment. That's 2 people I've heard from. There's 18 more people who can say something here. 18 more people. Nothing more for culture and environment? Okay. Okay. Let's, okay. There'll be a lot for this one. So what about ideas of politics and power and authority and governance? What are some of the most important ideas that we heard about with that, in regard with those? Okay, so Cindy here says we have numerous dynasties, right? I'm going to do this here. Cindy says we have numerous dynasties, and that's true, right? We have dynasties that go all the way back to 2000 BC, right? With the Jia, which may or may not have been fictional, depending on what you think. We have the Jia, then we had the Shang come after them, and then the Zhou, and then the Zhou lasted for quite a while, and then we had this warring states period where everything was chaotic. Then we had the Qin, which is a very short one, and then we had the Han that comes after. And of course there are a handful of dynasties that come after the Han, which we won't deal with as a group because we don't have enough time. But China's kind of a history of dynasties, of lines of hereditary kings or emperors, right? And that line is almost 4,000 years long, and almost brings us into the modern world, because the last Chinese dynasty is overthrown in 1911, I believe. Karen says, the unification of states led to the formation of China and the first emperor. Yes, that's true. And a new way of governing people was formed. Yeah, so empire is kind of a specific form of government where one central group or one state controls a bunch of neighboring people who are different to them, right? And empires will... we said there was an Akkadian empire that appeared... Oops, that was really loud. An Akkadian empire that appeared in Mesopotamia. But of course the Egyptians will build a small empire. Alexander the Great will come across the Near East and Asia and build an empire there. The Mauryans built an empire in India. We talked about Chandragupta Maurya and his grandson Ashoka. Here, the Chinese build an empire. Of course, the Romans will build an empire very shortly, which we'll talk about. And so empires are, they're all the rage in this period, as certain states, certain small states and certain rulers have the ability to gain control over large groups of people who are more or less different from them, right? So this is kind of a new way of governing people, the creation of empire and the creation of the political office of emperor, right? Yeah, we saw that particularly in the Qin dynasty, the emperor became the sole source of authority, right? And so Qin Emperor, the first Qin Emperor, ruled with absolute power, right? Not for very long, but he did it. Casey also says that Oh yeah, Zhou kinship feudalism. Political economic system based on fragmented authority where a set of obligations between lords and rulers in exchange for some type of service. Yes. So we saw that the early Zhou kings sent out members of their royal family to rule certain areas in the countryside, and in those little areas they were basically little kings. They were mini kings of their own area. All they had to do was obey the Zhou king and maybe send him some money from time to time, right? That's a feudalistic that's feudalism more or less. And so the early Zhou create this sort of political and economic system to manage their little empire. As we know, it kind of falls apart over time, but initially it seems to work, right? And of course, we have feudalism in Europe that operates for quite some time, for hundreds of years during the Middle Ages. Yeah, Qin was the first emperor, right? The first official emperor is Qin. That's good, Cindy. KC says we have the appearance of legalism. Yeah, so this idea of a law code that applies to everyone equally with very clear rewards and punishments for people. Yeah, and that comes again from Shanyang, from the later Zhou period, and is becomes more formal during the Qin Empire. Cindy says feudalism was a political and economic system characterized by fragmented authority. That's true. So a bunch of people in the countryside had authority and they were just supposed to listen to one guy. Sometimes that worked and sometimes it didn't, but you're very right, Cindy. Pearly, the government was headed by an emperor and a royal family. Yes, and that starts out almost from the very beginning, right? We have with the Jia, which with the Shang, with the Zhou, and that kind of idea of royalty or monarchy is one that lasts all the way through China. And so, which is kind of interesting because when you think about it, China has a very long history of being ruled by one person, right? By being ruled by a monarch, whether they are a king or whether they are an emperor, right? Democracy is something that doesn't really develop in China. Oligarchies don't develop in China. Theocracies, so a state that's run by a religious sect or priests, that doesn't develop either. So China has a long history with kind of one type of government, which is monarchy, where there's one ruler. Yeah, that's worth saying. Let's see, politics, power, authority, and governance. You know, the only other thing we should mention with regard to that is that mandate of heaven thing, although we could probably include that under spirituality as well. But we could probably say that leaders, kings or emperors, they legitimized their rulings. So the reason that they were in charge was because the mandate of heaven, right? So heaven had given them the power to rule. And if they didn't do a good job, then heaven would take that power back and give it to someone else, right? And so Chinese dynasties have a long history, starting really with the Shang dynasty, the first or second dynasty in China, of using that type of idea, saying that, you know, the last empire, the last emperors that we just got rid of, they lost the mandate of heaven. Heaven didn't support them anymore, but now heaven supports us, and so we are this new dynasty and we're going to rule. Maybe that's the only thing that we need to add there. What do we see in terms of interactions and exchanges? Interactions and exchanges. What did we see? So Karen says we saw trade along the Silk Road. Yes. So China's engaged in trade with the outside world for a long time. It's going to flourish in the Han the Han Dynasty, but it starts out earlier, right? And so we see them trading different types of metalwork, right? We see them trading pottery and bronze work and things, which the Chinese are really good at. But probably the road gets its name from silk, right? Because silk is a very unique fabric, right? That comes from China. It's from the silk of little silkworms. And so it becomes very valuable in other parts of the world because it's very soft, right? Silk is very soft and luxurious. And at the time, nobody knows where it comes from and nobody knows how it's made except the Chinese. And so it becomes a commodity that they can charge a lot of money for, and they make a lot of money from it. Yeah. Well, in the modern world, yes, lots of manufacturing is done in China currently, right? Aliana, that's true. Yeah, the Chinese are involved in trade. Good. I guess you could say, yeah, interactions and exchanges. So we see, I guess, different historical periods or different dynasties interacting in this way, right? So something that comes from the sort of the later Zhou period and the Warring States period, which is Confucius and Confucian ideas, wind up finding their way into, or wind up influencing Confucius, and then Confucius will influence the Han Dynasty later on. So I guess we see kind of an influence of the sort of world and situation around Confucius, and that influences his ideas, and then his ideas will later influence, the world and society a couple of hundred years later. Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one, Cindy. Yeah, the Silk Road was a trade route between China and the West, yes, and would remain so for hundreds of years later. Trade routes through Asia and Europe to exchange goods. Okay, that's good, Adalbert. Yeah, so the Chinese are engaged with trade, and there's also some influence between dynasties, right? And so Confucius and his ideas are someone that connects the early Zhou period all the way to the Han centuries later, right? So yeah, I like that. That's good. Conflicts. Where do we see conflicts and conflict resolution here? Okay, so Casey says the Zhou kings were able to, initially their ability to control those lords failed. It failed over time, right? Initially they were able to control them because they were members of their family, right? So you would send out your nephews or your brothers or your cousins to rule, to be lords in the land, and of course they would listen to you because you're family, right? And you support each other. But eventually that system failed, right? Because a few generations later, people weren't closely related anymore. They were like, oh yeah, the Zhou king is my fourth cousin, so who cares, right? And so, yeah, that system worked very well to begin with, but then later failed, right? Conflict and conflict resolution. Confucius struggled with the order expressed in spirituality and the chaos in real life. Yeah, I guess that's a conflict as well, right? The rituals that Confucius was practicing as a child and the ones that he saw Chinese people practicing suggested a certain type of order, right? It suggested that the Chinese were maintaining some kind of societal order, but that wasn't really the way that the world was, right? He lived during the Warring States period when it was chaos and there was lots of fighting and no sort of political centralization. So yeah, that was a conflict for him, right? And of course it led him to pursue his ideas of what a good, stable, organized society should be. Yeah, that's good. KC says states battling for power and prestige, and 540 wars. Only 15 states remained, and only one in the end. Yeah. So all of these little states, little kingdoms that had been set up during the early Zhou period, eventually started fighting with each other, right? And so they started to take each other over. At one point, there's 15, and then eventually everything gets consolidated under one guy, which is the Qin Emperor, right? Karen says some people tried to kill the emperor but were executed. Yeah, we saw that in the film, right? There was a I'm not sure if they were going to kill him or if they were just going to sort of push him out of power. I'm not sure what the plot was, but either way, Karen, you're right. There was a plot to take power away from the Qin Emperor, but they were executed. That's true. There were wars with surrounding territories. Yeah, we saw lots of warfare. Intellectuals were killed due to riots. Yeah, so when the Qin Emperor started to put laws in place and strong punishments, people who were learned, people who were intellectuals, criticized the Qin Emperor and wound up thrown in a hole and buried, right? So that's a conflict right there. And there was a civil war, yeah, after the death of the Qin Emperor, right? Yeah, so after he dies, there's I think it's actually, it might be a few emperors later where there's civil war, but you're very right, Karen. There's a civil war that follows the Qin Empire, and eventually the war comes to an end when Liu Bong, the first Han emperor, comes to power. Good. And after the Qin Dynasty debacle, ooh, good word, debacle. There was civil war for 5 years. Yes, so we've got lots of conflicts, mostly warfare. Okay, good. What else do I have for you? Oh yeah, values and beliefs. So what kind of values and beliefs did we learn about here? Oh yeah, okay. So we have some Taoist beliefs. That's true. We met the Taoists. Casey says the Taoists. Oh, nice. You guys tag team there. That's awesome. So Taoists, they believe in the way, right? And so the way is that it's this sort of invisible force, right? It's where the universe comes from. It sort of permeates everything in the world, and it dictates the way that the world operates, right? And so the Tao is mysterious, the source of life in the universe, but we cannot see the Tao, we cannot hear the Tao or feel the Tao, but if we calm our minds and empty them of desires, then we will be in alignment with the way. We'll be in alignment with the Tao, and then we can live our lives in a very easy fashion, right? If you're constantly fighting against the way the universe works, if you're constantly fighting against the Tao, it's going to be really difficult for you, right? So the Taoists say, empty your mind of desire. That will put you in alignment with the Tao, and then things will be easy and effortless. At least that's what they start saying at the beginning, right? Karen says, belief in immortality in the afterlife. Yeah, so we see that particularly with the Qin Emperor, right? He's trying to gain immortality, right? He's trying to live forever. That's why he's taking the mercury. And there is evidence of the afterlife as well, right? And we see that, I didn't point it out at the time, but we see that very early on, because even when civilization is starting to develop in the Yellow River Valley and the Yangtze, we see people, I think you might remember reading about this, some people are buried with fancier stuff than other people, right? And so that suggests that there's a wealth difference, a difference in wealth and power in society. But it also kind of assumes that if you're going to put something in a grave with someone, there's almost an idea that that person is going to use it later on, right? And so it implies that there's some sort of idea of the afterlife, right? I'm going to put this in the grave of this person because they're going to need it after death, somewhere, somehow, right? So that's very true. We see that, and certainly with the Qin Emperor, where he builds that army of terracotta soldiers and horses and things, that seems to be evidence of an afterlife as well. And I think in the Confucius video, we also saw the tomb of a Chinese king or emperor as well. And I think there were a bunch of chariots and carts and horses in the grave as well. So that's, again, evidence of an afterlife, right? They think that the king will be able to use these things later on in the next world or wherever or whenever, right? Let's see. So Karen had that. Taoism, yes, which we talked about. Yeah, the honor of ancestors, right? Filial piety and the honor of ancestors who have already died, right? There's a concept that those ancestors need to be cared for, and that goes all the way back to the Shang dynasty, right? The Shang had those oracle bones, if you remember, and the oracle bones sometimes were asking the gods, but sometimes were asking questions to dead ancestors, right? So there's an idea that you can talk to your ancestors who have died already, but also that you need to honor them and care for them, right? And that's something that's going to persist through sort of ancient and imperial Chinese culture. You got a lot of stuff in here, Karen. And Confucius ideologies, yes. So Confucius created this sort of moral, philosophical system, which again was not successful during his lifetime, but did become important during the Han, right? Yeah, and Confucianism. Good. Okay, cultural expressions. What do we see in terms of the way that people express their culture? Yeah, what do we see there? What do we see in here? Cultural expressions. So maybe music, maybe artwork, maybe dance, maybe any and all of those things. Did you see those things? Oh, sorry, Karen's got one here. Karen says, music and dance. Yes, so we very clearly, we saw music and dance in the documentary about the Qin Emperor, right? He had that kind of party in his palace, right? It looked very swanky and fancy. And we saw a couple people playing stringed instruments. We saw people with the bells, right? And we saw those bells in the documentary about Confucius as well, right? The host of that documentary, Bethany Hughes, I think her name was, she was ringing those bells too, right? So we saw those sort of metal bells that people were using. We saw some stringed instruments. We saw dances, right? So in the documentary about the Qin Emperor, we saw those women doing a very choreographed dance, right? Maybe for the emperor. Yeah, and we also saw rituals and marriage ceremonies. Yeah, so marriage ceremonies are a good expression of cultural values as well. Although it wasn't quite clear what was happening in some of those things, it was interesting to see. Yeah, Casey said Confucius believed that music had the power to harmonize and transform an individual. Yeah, so not just the listening to of music, but the playing of music, right? So if you, it had to do with Confucius's idea that if you performed a ritual and you performed it with emotion, right, with sincerity, if you did that, it would change who you were on the inside. It would sort of make you a better person. And so music can be like that too, right? If you perform, if you play an instrument with feeling, with emotion, Confucius is kind of saying that can help make you better inside, right? Right. So we saw, yeah, that's a good one too, Cindy, actually. We saw Confucius take earlier ritualistic beliefs. So a ritual is an expression of culture. He kind of took them and he kind of reimagined them and transformed them into something else, right? He took ritual, spiritual, religious ritual, and turned it into kind of moral philosophy, right? So he kind of changed one thing into another, right? So I guess he created a cultural expression that didn't really exist. And again, Confucius was interesting because, again, his idea of how people should behave is entirely, or almost entirely, disconnected from the gods, from the heavens, right? So if you are a member of a Judeo-Christian religion, so if you're Jewish, or if you are Muslim, or if you are Christian, you will know that kind of the source of moral authority comes from up there, right? I was raised Catholic, and so, the very clear expression of that is the 10 Commandments, right? Moses comes down from the mountain, and he's got 10 Commandments written by God, and God says, hey, don't do this stuff, right? That's where morality and ethics kind of start to come from. They come from up there. But Confucius has a totally different idea, right? He says that you should treat people a certain way simply because they are humans, right? And don't do to other people what you wouldn't do to yourself. Or I think the way Confucius actually says it is, what you would not want done to you, don't do that to other people, right? So he's got a lot of ideas about morality and ethics and how to treat people. And again, it's very interesting because it is totally disconnected from any sort of spiritual or supernatural authority, right? We're not going to treat people well because if we don't, we're going to go to hell, right? That's not what's happening here. You should treat other people well because that is your duty. That is your responsibility. It is your responsibility to be humane to other people, right? Which is an interesting idea. Okay. Last thoughts about China. Anything that we've left out, anything that we want to say before we kind of say goodbye to China? Last thoughts, last questions. Things that we should have said that we didn't. Who was the last emperor? That's very Googleable, and you might have to do it because I don't remember his name. The last dynasty, I think, is the Qing. I think it's overthrown in 1911 by a political party that is kind of social democratic. There's a social democratic party. I think Jiang Jieshi or Chiang Kai-shek is a member of that party, and I think Mao is at the very beginning as well. And so that there's a few political parties in 1911 that are kind of fighting for power, and they wind up pushing out the last emperor. What his name is, I do not remember, Karen. That's a Googleable question. Fu Yi is the last emperor. Okay, I trust you, Carmen. Okay, so Fu Yi, last emperor, and I'm pretty sure it's 1911 when he is pushed out, and we have a kind of social democratic. Okay, thanks, Carmen. We have a social democratic party come to power. Of course, if you know your Chinese history at all, you'll know that that party sort of splits. Mao forms a communist party. Jiang Jieshi and Mao kind of battle for control of China for a little while. Things get put on pause during World War II. And then at the end of World War II, the two sides kind of start fighting again, and Mao will win. Jiang Jiexi's group will flee to Taiwan, I believe. And then Mao will declare People's Republic of China in 1949. So again, it's pretty remarkable that we have a string of empires that goes really from 4,000 years ago, or a string of dynasties, I should say, that goes from 4,000 years ago all the way until 1911, which wasn't that long ago, right? My grandfather was born in 1911, so very, very recent, really long history, but kind of a cool one, and one that we probably haven't had time to give proper treatment to. Okay, so that said, the next thing we'll deal with is Greece. Okay, so Greece is an important civilization for the Western world. I know we've been in the East for a little while, but Greece is an important civilization for the Western world because a lot of things get developed in Greece that later will be kind of borrowed or plagiarized by the Romans, and then Western civilization will really look to Rome as a model for how European and American civilizations want to run themselves. And so Rome will become this kind of legendary, epic model for what a democratic state should look like. And so the people who create the United States in the 1700s, they will look to Rome as kind of a model for how things should work. And much of Roman culture, or at least the way the Roman Empire develops, is borrowed from the Greeks. And so for Western countries, either Western Europe or, well, all of Europe, and for North America, particularly the United States, Rome is a pretty important culture as kind of a parent culture, and therefore Greece is as well, because the Romans will steal quite a number of ideas from the ones that are developed by the Greeks a little bit earlier than them. So there's kind of lots to deal with in Greece. It's pretty cool. I'm going to try and shorten it up because I usually spend a little more time on Greece, but I'm going to try and keep it nice and tight. So that might be a challenge for me, but I'll do my best. So that said, I think I might leave it there for today. Do you have any? Whoops. Do you have any last questions on anything before we end class? I'm here to answer all of your questions, except for who was the last Chinese emperor, because I didn't know that one. But all the other ones I can answer for you. Okay, so Jimmy's good. Cindy's good. Sam's good. It looks like a good picture of you there, Sam. I know it's pretty tiny, but how did one become an empress? Oh, that's interesting. We kind of we didn't really talk about empresses, and there were a few, right? I think in the case of, there's usually two ways, okay, and I'm in general, okay. So in the ancient world, women come into power in two ways. Mostly one way. Mostly they are the wife of the ruler, so they're the wife of Pharaoh, or they're the wife of the king, or they're the wife of the emperor. The Pharaoh, the king, the emperor will die, and then the wife, so the queen or the empress, she will manage to sort of step into his shoes and continue ruling. So sometimes she's a strong enough character to do that on her own. Sometimes she has a child that is actually the king or the emperor, but the child is too young to be the king. The child is 9 or something, and so she will rule for the child until the child is old enough. But usually what happens is that we have the wife of a king or a pharaoh. King or the pharaoh will die, and the wife will manage to be a strong enough personality in order to put herself in the throne and start to rule. And I think that's what happens with the Chinese empresses, and I think there are 3 or 4 of them. And it happens in ancient Egypt as well. You probably don't recall, but we mentioned Hatshepsut, which she was a female. She was a female pharaoh. Cleopatra is another female pharaoh, but she comes later on. So that's usually how it works. Usually you're the wife of the king. The king dies, and you through careful calculation or just being a really strong personality, or ruling for your child who is too young to be king, you manage to put yourself in power. And I think that's how it happened in ancient China, but I'm not 100% sure. And now that you mentioned that question, Karen, I feel like that's something we should have paid attention to. But maybe I'll have a more complete answer for that one on Monday, if that's okay with you. Because I think it's something that we should at least address. So that's a good question. Okay. We'll deal with that one. We'll deal with that one on Monday. Especially if you're curious, Karen, on how to become a ruler of, a country today, you might want to know how to make yourself a ruler. So I'll help you out with that. Okay. Other than that, I think I'm going to leave it there. You can have the rest of this class to work on your micropaper, which I think is due on the 21st, which is that next week? That's next. Oh no, it's not next week. It's the week after. Nope. Wait, what's today? Yeah, it's the week after. So that's actually kind of a long time. But I would get working on it if I were you. If you need some help, you can email me and I'll look over it as quickly as I can. But until then, I think I'll leave it there. Okay. So thanks for being here. Those of you who are participating in the live chat, good work. You did a good job. We did a good job, I think, summarizing the important parts of Chinese history and culture that we needed to learn. So I'll sign off. Hope you have a nice weekend. See you Monday. Bye.